Hello, I'm Tom, and you are watching my review of Resident Evil 7 Biohazard. First of all, why am I reviewing this game now? Well, I think Biohazard stands as one of the best horror games to release during this last console generation. As we start to move on to the next generation, this seemed a good time to go over the main points of why I think that way. The review is going to be made up of several videos, each one functioning as a standalone review that focuses on a few specific points that allow the game to achieve success. In this video, those points are the design, immersion and atmosphere that the game offers up. It seems fair to say that to consider a piece of media to be good at horror, it should be scary. Lots of things can scare us, but I think in general you can separate them into two categories, which I'll call short-term scares and long-term scares. A good example of a short-term scare is one of the most infamous horror movie tropes, the jump scare. This descriptive name refers to the fact that when the scare happens, you will jump. Wikipedia describes the jump scare as being intended to scare the audience by surprising them with an abrupt change in image or event, usually co-occurring with a frightening sound. As you might expect, this shock can cause a release of adrenaline and maybe even an elevated heart rate. The jump scare by its very nature is quick, and as a result any effects it causes also disappear quickly, which is why it receives the categorization as a short-term scare. A long-term scare is, by comparison, not like this. These take a lot more build-up, but the end result is that they stick with you for far longer. The effects of a long-term scare are much more abstract and would likely be described differently by each individual. But an example could be the immense feeling of dread that can take over a mind when thinking about how your life as an individual is meaningless in the face of the impending climate catastrophe, or when I think about how much time I've spent playing games in the Monster Hunter series. These two categories often go hand in hand, and a good piece of horror media will generally use both. For most people though, the piece of media's ability to create some form of long-term scare is the metric to determine how successful or good that piece of media is as a piece of horror media. This is because something that provokes a big or prolonged emotional response is by its nature something that's a bit more meaningful to us than something we have no reaction to. The effects of long-term scares last longer, or in other words, the emotions they provoke are experienced for far longer and can be considered more intense as a result, and so the provoking media is remembered more fondly. Fondly might not be the best word to use when we're talking about something made specifically to scare us, but you get the idea. For a video game to achieve a long-term scare, it needs to perfect the art of player immersion. The word immersion gets thrown around a lot in games journalism, but I think horror games are one of the genres where it's most important and most relevant to talk about. Without a player being immersed, the game's creators will be unable to get them to believe anything that's going on in front of their eyes. If they don't get tricked into believing anything, then they won't fully engage with it. If they don't fully engage with it, then it's nearly impossible for a long-term scare to establish itself. If a long-term scare can't establish itself, then by our metric of assessing what makes a good piece of horror media, you've got yourself a maybe not so great horror game. Horror games, by their very nature, can sometimes struggle to create a sense of immersion. Video games are, after all, not real. Think about this while you're playing a game and your mind will wander and reach conclusions like not only is everything you're seeing and interacting with not real, it's also all following a set of predetermined and finite rules that govern everything about it. Break it down further and those rules are being upheld by lines upon lines of ones and zeros, and after a single math class, not even children are afraid of those. It's for this reason that a horror game has to do everything it can not to remind you of the fact that it is in fact a video game you are playing. In other words, it needs to keep you immersed. After immersion, there's another element needed to ensure a game can deliver a long-term scare. It needs to create an atmosphere conducive to delivering one. By this, I mean every design element that goes into delivering each and every scare a game has to offer needs to be on point and working together. When this happens, each one of those scares will be at their maximum effectiveness, which in turn can contribute towards or even create a long-term scare. The two concepts of atmosphere and immersion do bleed into one another to a degree. After all, each one contributes to the success of the other. I want to explain how these two design goals working together in unison allow Biohazard to deliver its long-term scares, which in turn is one of the reasons I think it's such a good horror game. In other reviews, the term photorealistic pops up often when people describe how the game looks. Personally, I wouldn't go that far, but that's perhaps due to the fact that I played the game on a standard PS4 instead of a souped up PC. The quality of the graphics on show do help with immersion to a degree, but I think the importance they carry is often a bit misunderstood. First of all, nobody expects people to be immersed the second they press start on a title screen. Instead, there's a period of time that needs to pass before you can say you're immersed. For the way I've set things up, that means the playtime it takes until you're not really looking at things and thinking, wow, these ones and zeros have come together in a really good way, and instead you're taking in what you're seeing just because you are seeing it. If you go back and play an old game today, for a while you probably look at everything and think, wow, these ones and zeros have come together in a way that looks bad in comparison to what we see nowadays. After some time of playing though, these thoughts will start to come less and less, until eventually they stop coming, and instead you just take in the world of the old game for what it is. This point is what I would consider to be immersion when we're talking about it solely from a visual quality perspective. With that in mind, it makes sense to assume that better graphics directly help in reducing the time it takes for thoughts about ones and zeros to stop being formed in our minds. Biohazard's visuals are, on a technical level, pretty good. This means that after a short while, you probably won't be thinking of them in terms of ones and zeros, which in turn is the first step the game takes to getting us immersed. Stepping away from technicalities but still building on our thoughts about the visuals, the art direction can also be considered to be very good. The overarching scope of the game is small. For the most part, it takes place within the home of a single family. This smaller scope means that every design element in turn gets more attention, and the approach of small but detailed instead of large but bare pays off when it comes to atmosphere and immersion. Let's begin with looking at the location the game spends most of its time, the Baker Ranch. Situated in the bayou of Louisiana, the buildings that make up the ranch are both familiar and foreign. These are not the elaborate mansions and castles that have been seen in past Resident Evil games. While now they're broken and uncared for, they were still clearly a home of a normal family at some point. To achieve this, the developers have created each building and room by looking at level design through a grounded lens. Kitchens, living rooms and bedrooms are all very normal everyday environments. In fact, I bet you're watching this in one right now, and yet it's in rooms like this that the bulk of your time will be spent. In other games, a boss encounter is usually cause for a grand spectacle, but your first run-in with a proper boss here doesn't take place against some cinematic backdrop. Instead, it takes place in a regular old garage. This familiar approach to designing the setting and environments allows the player to more readily connect with what they're seeing, or in other words, it helps them get immersed. But of course, the ranch is only the first of three main areas in which the game takes place. The ship and the salt mines are much smaller by comparison, which is a good thing because they're not nearly as engaging. Design-wise, this is because these settings just don't have the elements we've just covered that make the ranch so successful. There's no personality or unique aspects intrinsic to these locations, and as a result they fail to connect with the player in the same way that the ranch does. One way the ranch manages to succeed is thanks to what was placed into the many rooms it houses. Everywhere you look around this family's home is filled with objects and visual niceties, and yet it all feels like it deserves to be there, because it is, after all, a home where people lived. This level of visual clutter was achieved with the reuse of a lot of assets, but this replication was done in a tactical way that never really jumps out as being obvious. The first time I really noticed it was when the game basically points it out with this clock puzzle, which is solved by realizing every clock texture is exactly the same. The structural design of the halls and rooms housing all those elements has also been put together with careful planning. Overall, we can say that the game is fairly linear, which seems a good choice when we approach atmosphere and immersion from a planning perspective. If the game's creators can control and know exactly where you'll be and exactly where you'll be looking at each point in time, then they have the power to place every element within the world at the point where it'll maximise the scare factor. An example of this is the very start of the game, where Ethan is forced along a set path towards the guest house. The sights, music, and ways you interact with the world are all meticulously placed to build the atmosphere and get you primed for a good scare. However, if this sort of hand-holding goes on for too long, then it runs the risk of losing some of its efficacy. If there's little input that you the player can have on this world, then the game becomes an experience similar to that of a haunted house ride at a fair. The clever way Biohazard manages to avoid this happening is by interspersing these more linear sections with more open areas, where more organic scares will arise as opposed to inorganic, controlled ones. We can see an example of this design after opening the door into the main house proper. After a rather linear section, Ethan suddenly has multiple paths open to him, with several doors leading to unknown parts of the house. The way in which you have to progress does actually remain fairly linear, but this switching of designs between what's clearly a linear route and what is seemingly a more open area recurs multiple times throughout the game, at the precise point where the player might start to become accustomed to how they've been following the progression route. Backtracking is required at certain points, but is also largely optional. The times where the player might want to do this are timed to near perfection. Items like the Scorpion Key are placed at the point where the player will likely remember most of the doors it can be used for. This reduces the progression downtime, and as a result it keeps the tension and atmosphere high. However, this is a difficult line to tread, and the downside is that it resulted in the complexity of a lot of puzzles being kept to a minimum. The most common type of puzzle involves manipulating an object to create the perfect shadow. The objects required to create the perfect shadow are never too far from the puzzle, and there are no other objects you can attempt to complete the puzzle with other than the correct one. This keeps the atmosphere high by ensuring no long periods of time are spent by the player failing to understand how to complete a puzzle. In the worst case conclusion to this scenario, they might pull out a phone and search for the answer, undermining all the game's attempts at inducing immersion. With this in mind, the simplistic puzzle design was logical, however in this state they rarely take more than a few seconds to overcome, which is fairly disappointing, at least to me. Of course, puzzles aren't the only occupants of these rooms and hallways. Perhaps unsurprisingly, this American estate is home to something terrifying: Americans. Each member of the Baker family was designed to encompass a different trope common in horror media. Jack Baker, while he's chasing you down with shovels and other sharp objects, evokes classic slasher media like Friday the 13th and Halloween. Marguerite, with her bugs and exaggerated limbs, takes inspiration from body and natural horror. Lucas was designed to design traps, evoking the psychological horror of films like Saw. Horror is very subjective, and had the designers stuck within one area and tried to make each family member consistent within that, they would run the risk of missing the mark when it came to scaring certain players. If you were to design a game based around slasher media, and player A doesn't give a shit about slasher media, well, you're out of luck. Casting the net wider by designing each member of the family around a different theme like this is extremely clever, because it increases the chances that at least one member of the family will strike a nerve within each person who plays the game. The Bakers aren't the only thing that are after Ethan though. We also have the Molded, Biohazard's answer to the problem that everybody is pretty sick of the classic zombie. When I was at university, I rented a house with friends. I don't know how it is in other parts of the world, but in the UK it's fair to say that student housing is pretty shit. You're likely to only be renting a place for a year or two before moving to a new one, so landlords tend not to put a lot of effort into things. One problem that's very common in houses like this is mould, and we were no exception. A leak above our kitchen roof meant that the stuff grew constantly and at a surprisingly fast rate. Because the landlord didn't give a shit, the core issue of the leaky pipe never got addressed properly, and thus for those 2 years our fight with the mould never once ceased. No matter how hard we tried to get rid of the stuff, it always came back. It being in the kitchen, where we prepared all of our food to eat, made it even more disgusting and frustrating. The point of this story is that I really don't like mould, which is why I think the Molded and the designs around them are pretty great. Objectively, the designs are fairly plain. They look a bit gooey and have a big toothy mouth for a head, which doesn't really break new ground design-wise. The various forms they take are also fairly standard, and tweak the base design by dropping it down onto all fours or increasing its size rather than attempting to create something new. While this was disappointing, it's their core premise, that is, them being made of the disgusting shite that is mould, that elevates them above the ranks of a regular zombie in my eyes. You can get right up in to inspect all of their gross details thanks to the game taking place in the first person perspective. Biohazard is the first Resident Evil game that takes place from this perspective, and while the most obvious impact is on the moment-to-moment gameplay, it also had a big effect on how the game handles design and immersion. On the immersion front, simulating what we would literally see through our own eyes seems a sensible choice. The game takes pains to never show you Ethan's face, which I believe was intentional in order to better facilitate the process of the player projecting themselves into his shoes. This perspective is also far more claustrophobic than a third-person camera because, of course, you can only see what's directly within your field of view. The level design takes full advantage of this to heighten the atmosphere of tension throughout the game. Hallways themselves are narrow, which stimulates a feeling of claustrophobia in the surroundings as well as the perspective. Corners are often really sharp, and Ethan is never quite able to see what's behind each corner until he's already turning it. This intentional limiting of the information the player gets at each moment plays on our fear of the unknown. It's like when you pick up a pack of sausages at the supermarket and see the ingredients are 42% meat. Why are over half of the other ingredients of this meat sausage not meat? You don't know, and that's pretty unsettling, which is exactly how Ethan feels whenever he enters a new room in the Baker Ranch. The other benefit this perspective gives the designers is that they can force the player to see exactly what they want them to see at a particular moment. The most obvious form this type of design thinking takes is the most linear. That is, you can transition from a regular gameplay to a forced cutscene type moment instantaneously. An example of this is when Mia jumps out from the side room early on in the game. The design of the level clearly makes Ethan walk past this door multiple times, and each time he does so, nothing happens. After putting a fuse in a box to get the attic stairs operational, he has to walk past it one last time. The player's probably pretty keen to get up to the attic at this point, so they likely start running past this room, only for Mia to jump out and prompt the game to take away control. This is a fairly organic way of starting a cutscene section where the player has no or very limited control, and it's made possible thanks to this first-person perspective. Most of the game uses this approach to limit hard cuts that happen between events in an effort to keep immersion as high as possible. If you're given the opportunity to put the controller down whenever a cutscene starts by the virtue of it being essentially a video clip that you passively watch, then the immersion can fade, which in turn damages the atmosphere and tension that the game tries to create. This potential problem was why QuickTime events were added to Resident Evil 4, and this single take style of Resident Evil 7 seems to me like the natural progression of that. Of course, this type of design runs its own risks too. Because these are essentially cutscenes that you can't exert any control on, there's not actually any chance of receiving a fail state. If they're used too frequently, then there's a high chance the player will recognise this as a truth as soon as they're forced into one, which can break the immersion they try to maintain, and as a result, tension gets undermined. It's for this reason that the game also employs a more hands-off approach to getting you to see what it wants you to see, and it does this by using the level design to show you scares organically. We can see an example of this by revisiting that scene where Mia jumps out at the player. Before putting the fuse in the box, you have to actually find it, which entails going back through the kitchen to this cabinet at the front of the house. Once you've picked it up, you need to head back through the kitchen, at which point you can see Mia walk down the hallway. You remain in full control of Ethan while this happens, which makes this feel a lot more organic, which in turn makes it feel a lot more surprising. By allowing you to keep full control while things like this happen, there's no tell for you to recognise them starting, meaning of course that in the back of your head you know something like this could happen at any time, which adds to the tension of moving through the game. Another example of this is the first time you see Jack after leaving the dinner table. To me, this represents the best of how linear level design allows Biohazard to generate its organic scares. You have to walk down this path and you're essentially forced to see this, but what you choose to do in that moment is up to you. Do you freeze and hope he turns the other way, or do you run backwards and find a hiding space? We'll talk more about this type of decision making when we talk more about the gameplay, but for now we can just appreciate how the design aiming to create peak immersion and atmosphere allows these types of decisions to be possible in the first place. The last element of design that contributes to the immersion and atmosphere of Biohazard, that we'll talk about, is the sound and music that the game employs. While exploring, your effects on the world are often fairly minimal, and as such, you won't be making much noise. When you do interact with something, say when opening a door or smashing a cabinet to get an item, the resulting sounds are heavy and loud. What was previously a still and almost frozen atmosphere is suddenly broken, which always makes you think, shit, I really hope nobody heard and knows exactly where I am now. The quality of sound mapping on a technical level can put you on the other side of these events too. While sneaking around and trying to avoid the gaze of Jack or Marguerite, you can clearly hear their footsteps creaking away in whatever direction they're headed in. Given the limited perspective of first person, getting information this way is almost required if you want to successfully sneak past an enemy. The fact that it was implemented so well means trying to move while not being able to see them doesn't cause any frustration, which does wonders for keeping the immersion as well as raising the tension whenever one of these sequences plays out. Initially, you might think that there's not actually that much music present. The game is, after all, fairly short. On my first run, it took me around 7.5 hours to complete it. The official soundtrack runs for 2 hours and 28 minutes, consisting of 81 tracks. For context, the base soundtrack for The Witcher 3, which according to howlongtobeat.com takes around 51 hours to complete the main story, runs for 1 hour and 21 minutes, consisting of 35 tracks. With that in mind, we can say that the sheer volume of music here is impressive, and the overall linearity of how the game plays out allows the use of each piece of music to be carefully controlled and placed to help the game convey what it wants to convey at every given moment. When it's building up a scare, the music will too, while during a chase it'll sound urgent and energetic. For everything in between, it's dark and foreboding, with elements intrinsic to the environment you're traversing woven into the sounds. I think one of the music's best achievements from a design perspective is just how understated it is. It fits perfectly and enhances what's happening in front of your eyes, but it never gets in the way or stands out in such a way that your brain actually processes it in any form of isolation. It doesn't jump out to you as being obvious that this game has more music than one several times its length, which I believe shows that it succeeds at achieving these goals. If I had to describe the design of Biohazard in one word, I'd use the word tight. Every element works to heighten the immersion and atmosphere that's necessary for the game to deliver good, genuine, long-term scares, both in their own right, but also by building and intertwining with every other element. There's the saying that a chain is only as strong as its weakest link, and the success of Biohazard's design comes from the fact that you'd be hard-pressed to point to any one element as being weaker than the other, and that rock-solid basis is the first thing we can point to back up the claim that Biohazard is a damn good horror game.